Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's Gail Hodges-Burt panel discussion entitled Strategic Interdependence Under Strain, Recalibrating the Transatlantic Relationship. And we'll be joined tonight by John Feiner, two seats to my left, Cornelia Voll, one seat to my left, and Renaud Lassou, senior, who's three seats to my left. Cornelia Voll is the professor of international political economy at the Heritage School. John is our Gail Hodges-Burt Fellow, and Renaud is the senior fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute. So this is the culmination of a day-long workshop that we've done. We had a whole array of current and former senior civil servants, scholars from various think tanks, academics. I think that pretty much covers it. Practicing attorneys, also a former senior civil servant, to discuss this issue. And if I can boil down all those large words, it's basically about what would we need to do? What would governments need to do on both sides of the Atlantic to clear away all the underbrush, clear away all the issues that have been outstanding for the last 18 months since the Trump administration came into office? And what might we achieve on the big questions that were outstanding at the time that we experienced the beginning of a whole cascade of disruptions in the international economic world? So it was a terrific discussion. It actually far exceeded my expectations. I should say prominently, it's underwritten by the Hewlett Foundation, and we're very fortunate that they have devoted generous resources so that we get to do this 4 more times over the next couple of years, because there are a lot of issues to cover. So let me just mention the Gail Hodges-Burt Visiting Fellowship. Those of you who know the Academy, many of you will know Gail. It was this fellowship was designed to bring outstanding U.S. individuals from the policy world to Berlin each year for an extended stay. It advances the bilateral conversation and increases the clarity of understanding between the U.S. and Germany, which is what the Academy is all about. Gail has been a trustee of the Academy since its founding in 1994. She's one of the really indispensable people on our board. She was the chairwoman of the Academy from 2015 until 2020, and she is a source of fantastic counsel for all of us. She began her career in the policy world straight out of college as an assistant to one of our founders, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. She was later the White House Social Secretary to President and Mrs. Ronald Reagan. She was later, I don't think we have a title for the person who is the wife of the ambassador, first lady in the country at the embassy later on. And she has been involved in a whole range of different nonprofits, including the International Republican Institute, the List Project, and the Polyphony Foundation. Have I suddenly just been electrified? How exciting. She's a strong advocate for the education of women and girls, has supported a number of Afghan girls in Afghanistan and in the US, and has worked in that field for years. So this fellowship honors her remarkable service to the Academy and to the German-American relationship. As it happens, this year's Gail Hodges-Burt Fellow is even a friend of Gail Hodges-Burt, John Feiner, who has achieved the pinnacle of his career by being the Gail Hodges-Burt Visiting Policy Fellow at the Academy, is also the Senior Leadership Fellow at Yale Law School. He's a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He served for 4 years as the principal deputy national security advisor to President Joe Biden. And as I never tire of saying, that is the toughest job, certainly in foreign policy in the U.S. government.
Job, so I appreciate toughness.
Oh, it's the worst job. It is the person who really I don't know, has to make the sausage, I guess. Has to really make sure that all the different agencies line up and put together a coherent and advantageous policy that will serve the president well. Before that, he was head of geopolitical risk at Warburg Pincus, and before that, still during the Obama administration, had one of the other toughest jobs in the government. Toughest, not worst. Chief of Staff to Secretary John Kerry, and Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department. And that was the culmination of a number of different jobs that he'd had in the Obama White House. He began life as a journalist, covered the war in Iraq and several other conflicts. He is a graduate of Harvard College, Yale Law, Oxford University, and we come from the same town, so I'm really damn proud to know him. Cornelia. Cornelia Vole is professor of international political economy at Hertie, where she served as president from 2022 to 2026. And prior to assuming that job, she spent 20 years at Sciences Po in Paris, and had a variety of different roles there. She was also co-director of the Max Planck Sciences Po Center. Her research focuses on regulatory issues in the European Union and the United States, and she is a specialist on business government relations. She's the author of Corporate Crime and Punishment, Negotiated Justice in Global Markets, very Dostoevskian, The Power of Inaction, Bank Bailouts and Comparative Perspective, and Firm Interest, How Governments Shape Business Lobbying on Global Trade. Cornelia is the rare scholar who knows Europe and the US equally well, since she did her undergraduate degree and master's at the University of Chicago. She has a binational PhD from Sciences Po and University of Cologne, and a habilitation from Bremen, University of Bremen. Renaud is a senior research fellow at the Institut Jacques Delors. He's had a whole array of different high-level positions at the French Treasury, where he was assistant secretary in charge of European affairs, and representative for France in the European committees and institutions in charge of European trade policy. He also knows America very well, having spent 10 years in the US, including as minister counselor in charge of economic affairs at the French embassy in Washington. So we're just going to talk a bit about the subject at hand, and then we will open it up for questions. So, John, I will, since you are our Geopolitical Fellow, it's only appropriate I start with you. The several conversations I've been involved with you with here in Berlin have focused around the word de-risking. And that word got bandied about a tremendous amount in our conversation today. So why don't you tell us about the different kinds of de-risking that you see the Western democracies, particularly European democracies, being involved in and having to choose between?
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and an honor for me because, as you say, Gail is a special person, but always great to be at the Academy. De-risking is not a very poetic or lyrical or interesting word, but it is a pretty interesting concept, I think, and in particular interesting in the current moment because I first heard or encountered this word in the context of discussions between the United States and Europe about how to reduce our shared dependency on China. During the course of the Biden administration. This was a topic of much consternation in our administration, in our relationship with many European countries, with the European Union writ large. It was not a topic on which we always saw eye to eye, although I think we were closer to that by the end of the 4 years of the Biden administration than we were at the beginning. And the most interesting thing to me about how this phrase is currently used is that it is now often being applied to the United States. So I travel many other places in addition to Europe in recent months, including parts of Asia and most recently the Middle East. And a range of traditional, long-standing American partners are maybe not openly and publicly, but certainly quietly thinking about a strategy that reduces their dependency on us, on America. And that's not something that gives me pleasure as an American. It is certainly very closely tied to the policies, the global agenda, the way of doing business and treating other countries of the current administration. And it is certainly a feature of the landscape here in Europe, even as, and this was also a big aspect of our conversation today, the alternatives to the United States out there in the world for partnership are also highly imperfect, let's just say, to say the least. And so one of the things I was really interested in exploring today, and we did dig into, is what will be left of the U.S. relationship, the transatlantic relationship, the U.S. relationship with Europe at the end of 4 years of the Trump administration. You know, there may be a different sort of administration after that. There may not. But the big question I think many of us are interested in is, what does a shared agenda look like that has not been de-risked between the two sides? How do we think about China now in light of not just the 4 years in which we tried to get on the same page, but 4 years in which it has been very challenging, I think, in particular here, to deal with the U.S. administration? Where will that leave us a few years from now?
And in the course of the conversation, were you surprised or pleasantly surprised by this kind of this dichotomy between Europeans thinking about China and thinking about the U.S.?
Yeah, look, I don't envy being a European policymaker or diplomat in the current moment. I mean, there have been just an incredible series of shocks here. The Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine is a jarring, massive geopolitical moment, maybe the biggest geopolitical event that's happened since the end of the Cold War. Nearly simultaneous to that, well, maybe just a few years subsequent, thankfully, you've had the second shock of the United States signaling in almost every way that we are going to be withdrawing from our traditional security role in this part of the world. And so you add those two things together, and it's a highly disorienting moment. Meanwhile, you know, there are a lot of downsides to an enhanced economic relationship, certainly a security relationships beyond contemplation with China. So how Europe thinks about its role in the world is not actually something that surprises me that people are really puzzling through. It is actually a genuinely puzzling problem.
Yeah, I agree. Cornelia, you have conversations all the time with well-placed Germans in policy in the academy and elsewhere, not the American Academy, the academic world. And how would you just describe that dichotomy between the U.S. and China now if it can be said that there is a simple dichotomy, or if there's even one view that you could describe in Germany? There seems to me there are a whole lot of different views.
So let me start by saying we don't envy anybody who's a policymaker in Washington either. So I wouldn't want to switch with you. And maybe what I would describe the European space currently as is there were a lot of shocks, but I think there was also a lot of moments where we realized how we were functioning and what we were paying attention to in the past wasn't working like we expected. So call it rupture, call it Zeitenwende. I'll just say it, Germany was convinced that economic integration will bring peace and transformation, Wandel durch Handel. We believe the European project is one of our proudest achievements because the engagement across countries through integrated markets brought us peace on the continent. So there's something fundamentally, I would say, even an emotional attachment to this idea that economic integration brings security advantages and is also, beneficial for everybody. And the discussion we had today, to me, what changed in the last, and I don't think it's just the Trump administration, but in the last years, if not the last 2 decades, is the realization that global markets and the economic integration we benefit from through them are an exposure, a security exposure vulnerability also for us as countries, because we depend on technologies, we depend on innovation from others to a degree where you can I learned this word today, there can be a kill switch. So certain companies can turn off the internet, can turn off the satellites, can turn off something that is vital for us. And I think it's important to pause a moment and say that for many different countries, different parts of Germany, but many different countries in Europe, the realization that markets are not this benign, neutral, technical information system where we exchange goods and increase prosperity. It was a lot to swallow, and is also very hard as a signal to where we go from here. Do we want to become entirely insulated, more autonomous? Of course, the discussion now is we need our strategic autonomy. Who do you de-risk from? Can we provide it for ourselves? The short answer is no, because we're just so far behind. But we're also not China, so we cannot compete with many of the industries that are well advanced in the US or in China. We're in the food chain a little bit below. And the only hope to get some sovereignty over different areas back is if we do it together as a continent, and anything that is a European project is very difficult, is very slow, is 27 different member states, some very complicated member states in the middle of it blocking everything. So it's just a slow process in a moment where everything is happening very rapidly. And so if your best bet is to work through the European Union at a moment where invasions happen within days and things change very quickly and AI is accelerating everything, it's not very reassuring. But I do think that if there's one consensus across the continent, it's that our only chance globally is to band together somehow. And then muddling through that and actually getting somewhere is a tough route to go, but that's what I think will be the guiding guardrails going forward. Now, within that development, where Europe is more geopolitically conscious, is more geoeconomic about their own weight as a single market, who are the best allies and friends to bet on? Is it the return to the transatlantic relationship? Is it maybe a little bit of diversification, something in China, something in the US, something at home? Is what I think we'll be fighting over for the next years and decades with very little time if we make bad choices. And I don't think, I'm personally on the side of those that think, I don't think we'll go back to the transatlantic relationships of the before Trump years. I think too many things are broken and too many myths have been exposed as false. So the first von der Leyen commission said we'll be the geopolitical or geoeconomic, I think it was geopolitical commission. That was a little bit early, but that's still the direction in which Europe is going. And that means that some conversations are going to be more self-interested, nastier. We had very interesting fights and part of our workshop about who will put the loaded guns on the table in what conversation and actually threaten whom, and do you threaten your friends? Well, you never know with the Americans, but there's more of a use of power and instruments and actual threats. We apparently have kill switches in Europe too, which I didn't realize, but was very interested to learn about. So that will structure, I think, the discussion, but I don't think we'll go back to the world where everybody felt it was neutral and safe and beneficial to all. It is more of a self-interested world where you defend yourself.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like we've made great advances if we have introduced the kill switch into Professor Bull's lexicon. I think just as a point of reference, the original kill switch discussion was about the F-35s and the thought of Europeans buying lots of these unbelievably expensive, unbelievably complex planes and then having them drop out of the sky was not an encouraging one. Renaud, the conversation thus far has largely sort of overlooked the fact that many of the issues that confront us were issues that were confronting us before the advent of Trump, and that there was already a lot of difficult conversations going on during the Biden term. One of the most difficult ones was policies that were undertaken to deal with those vulnerabilities that Cornelia was speaking about, and in particular, industrial policy. And I think every German will remember the acronym IRA, which was perhaps the most ridiculously named legislation ever. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was all about providing lots and lots of tax breaks and subsidies for a lot of different industries. It's a good way to green the world as well. But from the vantage point of a year after the inauguration of Donald Trump, what do you think the debate over industrial policy looks like? And is this going to be something that we're doomed to fight about in a next administration, should it not be another disruptive one?
Thank you. I think it depends. If we address this issue like a traditional economic tool, we're going to fail. If we connect that issue with a big question of protecting and promoting our democracies, then we can agree. I was in DC at that time. So the so-called Inflation Reduction Act was voted. To me, it was a climate change plan. In fact, an industrial policy. It was industrial policy plus budgetary policy in order, and this is a connection with democracy, to bring, hopefully, jobs back in territories lacking economic opportunities, the roots of the election of Trump. So there was a narrative, there was a vision. And we totally missed that in Europe. The reaction was, this is protectionism. Narrow-minded view. And therefore we could not converge and agree with the US at that time. So the question is, if there is another administration working on that, we have to be ready to think big, then to agree. Another example connecting industrial policy and democracy. I personally believe that if we allow what we call Chinese mercantilism, Chinese subsidization to continue, our democracies in Europe are dead. It's just a question of time. I mean, they are not hiding their intention. It's written. They want to dominate every industry. So industry per industry, one per one. So the textile industry is over. Now we know it's the car industry. Tomorrow it's going to be Airbus. So if we allow this to continue, it's over. Our working class people, the middle class, world territories will be hit, and the voting consequences, I just spoke about it. So we have to equip ourselves in Europe with an industrial policy connected to trade policy to defend ourselves. Can we organize a positive conversation with the US on that? We spoke about that this afternoon. I think so. Today, not with that administration in the US, but with maybe, hopefully, an incoming administration from the US. Yes, we should. And therefore, industrial policy, to me, is a tool to protect democracy. And I was thinking, you were speaking about it, I was thinking, a word came back to me when Franklin Roosevelt spoke about the arsenal of democracy. And I don't know if you know that this sentence is from Jean Monnet. Jean Monnet was speaking at that time with Treasury Secretary Morgenthau, and he said, we have to craft an arsenal of democracy. And Morgenthau said, can I borrow you this stuff? And so today, of course, it's a peaceful arsenal of democracy. But industrial policy, trade policy should belong to, I think, a coordinated arsenal of democracy for the sake of protecting democracies, both in Europe and America. Today, we don't have that because it's too narrow-minded, but it's up to us to broaden and to create that conversation.
So I find that a terrific answer. I'll just tell you an anecdote. In 2022, I think I was asked to deliver the dinner talk at an annual, or actually twice annual meeting of a whole bunch of think tanks in the US and Europe. And I got up and defended the IRA and said, if the Democrats can't show that they can create manufacturing jobs in the US, then the democracy will be seriously challenged. And I was run out of the room on a rail, essentially. They let me finish my dinner, but I was booed. And I would be interested in hearing from the three of you how you would like that conversation to start again. I know that Renaud made his point, but I'm kind of wondering if we have had the conversations with our own people about what it is we're trying to do. I think that the IRA probably suffered in the US a little bit. It was very popular, but it suffered a little bit from being seen solely as a way of greening the country and not as truly industrial policy to revive lots of manufacturing. And certainly, European governments were furious about the IRA and thought that it was a way of beggaring thy neighbor because no European country could meet those kinds of subsidies. At least that was what the German government told us at the time. So fast forward, it's 2029. John, how would you conduct this conversation? What would it look like?
Thanks. I guess I'd just point out a few things about that legislation and what it means maybe for the future. Well, one, you mentioned the name. It is ironic that the most important piece of climate-related legislation in American history had to be named something like that in order to allow at least some people who don't believe in this concept to vote for it, but that says a lot more about America than anything else. But what is interesting is that this concept of reinvestment in America's industrial capacity is actually something that has a lot of bipartisan support in the United States, and is an area of, I don't want to say total continuity between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. There are not many of those, certainly not the relationship with this continent, but is an area of significant continuity, and I think would likely continue to be an area of continuity going into a new administration. We keep using this phrase, new administration, which really this far out feels like wishful thinking, and I'm not trying to tempt fate, but I do think this is something that is here to stay. In the United States, there is a bipartisan commitment to wanting to return to being an industrial power in America. And yes, it's about rebuilding the peaceful arsenal of democracy and is tied to kind of democratic health, but it is also about the arsenal of democracy in the sense that it was originally used. Our defense industrial capacity is something that we found during the course of our administration was wanting, decrepit even, when we really needed it. When Ukraine desperately needed significant assistance from the United States, we were able to do quite a lot, I think more than any other country when it came to security assistance, but not nearly as much as was required for the job and not nearly as much as we wanted to do because of the state of our industrial base. And now, fast forward, we've embarked on a highly, highly ill-advised conflict that has further depleted our defense capacity, at a time where there are real threats in Europe, real threats in the Indo-Pacific, and not a lot of capacity yet in the United States to regenerate the ability to defend ourselves. So that's not a good moment. And Europe is, by the way, going through an existential version of this in real time. And so I think to the point that was made about I think I agree, kind of misguided reaction to the IRA in Europe, I think we are now kind of all on the same page when it comes to the necessity of this. And the challenge is going to be doing it in a way that is responsible, that is mutually reinforcing, ideally, if we're in a place where the relations between the United States and Europe are good, and that is investing in the right industries, the industries that are going to be important for the future. This isn't about bringing, for us at least, textiles back to the United States as kind of a major industry. This is about the industries that we think are going to be most important to the economy of the future. And so do I have a ton of confidence that Washington is going to get that exactly right? No. Is it somewhat encouraging that at least both parties are committed to trying and are able on this one narrow issue to work together to an extent? I think that's a good thing.
And you're frequently in Europe. From your discussions with Europeans from a number of different countries, do you see that the hurdle has been overcome, and that there's a recognition that this is something that both sides of the Atlantic need to work on together?
I just compare the totally neutral reception that I've gotten in talking about the IRA to your being booed out of the dinner you described.
That's right.
This seems like a positive trajectory.
That sounds right. Well, good. That sounds good to me. Cornelia, one of the other challenges that we've been dealing with is protectionism, but not protectionism necessarily in the pursuit of industrial policy to rebuild the manufacturing base, but rather because we've now realized that we have all these sort of vital, critical industries that are hugely vulnerable to disruption by foreign powers. We found out some of that the hard way during the pandemic, but we've also found out through an array of different issues, critical minerals probably being the most widely discussed one. Do you see a sort of a preparedness in Europe for having a conversation? Would it be with the U.S.? Would it be with the G7? Would it, you tell me what the configuration would be that is going to sort of allay this problem so that we don't all feel like some of our most important industries are in one way or another in peril because of China or other hostile actors?
I'll answer your question, but let me just connect to the discussion previously. I find both of you transatlantically optimistic and a bit flowery in what you said about the possibility for industrial policy to be basically an arsenal of democracy, and that creating a joint interest for us to defend it. I think I get intellectually why the IRA was important for US democracy and why you did it, but that doesn't mean that it's helpful for our democracy, because you're still creating an instrument that will get industrial investment in your countryside and not in our countryside. And it'll create some clean tech that might be relevant for energy in the future in the US and not in Europe. So there is a competition still going on. I remember during the IRA discussion, we had a very big CEO of a very big German chemical industry saying, look, it's quite easy. We will have to relocate because if we go to China, they build us not just the factories, but the entire infrastructure, train system, etc., to transport things in and out. And that's very attractive. Or we go to the US and we know exactly the taxes we'll have to pay for the next 5, 10, 15 years, and you just cannot offer us that. So if you want to scale, we had the discussion about scaling, either one of these two options is much better than this European 27 pieces cake that we can't do anything with. And so this is my long way of saying, yes, it's always the economy stupid. Industrial policy is important for social cohesion and therefore for democracy, but democracy is national, it's domestic, it's everybody's home problem. And markets are global, they're shared, they create mobility. So we do have a European stake that's not going to be the same. It's not, I don't get, so educate me, I don't get what the answer would be that would be shared to a problem where we actually have two different spaces to take care of. I'd be interested to hear you, and then I'll say something about China afterwards.
Can I respectfully, for the sake of the debate?
Yes.
By the way,
have a European disagreement.
I don't think anyone's been called flowery at an American Academy event in quite a while.
From the very nitty-gritty technical standpoint to the more, democratically related stuff. First of all, regarding the nitty-gritties, there was, maybe I'm wrong, a provision inside of the Inflation Reduction Act that countries with trade agreements with the US could benefit from the financing. We could have prepared and proposed innovative trade instruments, such as sectorial trade agreements, in order to avoid all the problems of the transatlantic trading negotiations, to get access to this financing. And in that case, the question of competition would have been fixed.
If people respect trade agreements.
True, but since then, the same, well, it's a legal stuff, but the very same people in Brussels who said that we cannot do this kind of stuff with the Biden administration for legal reasons are exactly the same one who accepted a deal in Turnberry, killing one of the key bases of the WTO, the MFN provision, with no problem whatsoever. So we said no to Biden under WTO-related agreement, and we do exactly the contrary to Trump. But maybe it's too complicated. But so I think that we had technical tools to get access to the financing of the IRA. Then, to go up a little bit, I think we need the US democracy to function. And when the US democracy does not function, we pay a big price to remain polite. And so if the IRA, and maybe tomorrow something else, is an instrument to protect the US democracy, this is in our vested interest. And finally, we spend years, including my president, I mean my president, because I'm a French citizen, to say make the planet great again, criticizing the US for not doing enough on climate. And once the US at that time was doing something to protect climate, the biggest investment ever from the US in the climate policy, we said, no, I mean, it's for our interest as citizens of the world that the US is doing things. So I agree with you that maybe some industries are going to lose, but so technically I think we can fix it. And then if we look in the broader sense at the situation, then we have to organize a cooperation with the US because everything there is going into, I mean, in the sense of our interest. And so maybe my final stuff is, that's my personal comment, we have to extract these decisions or discussions from the private sector because they are bringing us in a very short-term, narrow, utilitarian way of addressing stuff. You know, maybe I'm stopping here.
You
Can I
want
say
to?
one thing,
Yeah,
one
sure.
quick thing in response? So, first of all, I had many French counterparts when I was in the government. I don't think I ever felt so validated by a French counterpart, and
but
I appreciate it. And I loved those men and women who I got to work with. I basically agree with what you said about the need to compete. And to be honest, when there was this ferocious European reaction to the IRA in the initial phase, our answer to them was, you are angry because this is likely to be effective, and you have an option, which is essentially to do a version of the same thing at the European level, as opposed to trying to kind of whittle us down and get us to implement it in a way that's most advantageous, which there were provisions that might have allowed. You have the ability to do this. You have the firepower to do this at the European level to remain competitive, and we wouldn't have been opposed to that. In fact, we would have been and were quite supportive of that effort. So yes, this is going to be a competitive dynamic when it comes to where these industries will be located and who will innovate the best. But if that kind of race to the top is going on between the United States and Europe, that is a much better situation than the alternative pre-IRA.
So I remember meeting with some of the top economics people in the Chancellery at the time, and they did not, of course, reciprocate. They did not want to get into that race, and their argument at the time was, we simply cannot afford to offer the kinds of incentives that the U.S. is, and the U.S. is going to draw an enormous amount of business out of Europe and leave us with more, with our own Rust Belt. So it struck me as a kind of blanket, black and white sort of answer that didn't really rise to the moment. The irony in all this, of course, was that corporate Germany was thrilled about the IRA. I remember we were doing a roundtable with in Stuttgart with Gina McCarthy, who was the president's top climate advisor, and I thought all the CEOs around the table were going to just they looked like they just wanted to slap her on the back and say, this is the best thing ever. First of all, a great investment for them, and second of all, their view was, if you want to green the country, create jobs to do it. Don't just regulate from the top. So it was a really interesting back and forth. I hope it's something we can learn from and do better the next time around. You wanted to say something about China.
Yes. So maybe a second point I have, which is larger first, and then I'll speak to China. So both of you answered with the competitiveness incentive. If everybody's competitive in the market, then we will be in a good space. And I absolutely agree. And I think that's how I think we can move forward. It's one of the discussions we had. What I am nervous about for the Europeans is if we say we'll get into a competition where we are bound to lose out. That's the Chancellery's fear, not just for one existing industry which might die. That's the rule of the game of the market, supposedly. But if we're systematically up against companies that have gotten so outsized that they have some advantage that we'll not get to either, because this is one phenomenon that U.S. economists call superstar firms, where because of globalization, technological change, you have a very high concentration of means, and you get these oligopoles or monopolies in certain markets that nobody can compete with. It's, as much as Mistral or others are trying, we're just not going to have the type of innovation they have in the U.S. or that you have in China. And China, some of our colleagues said China is the biggest market failure in global markets at all, because you can think of it as China Inc. It's just one big state-led economic enterprise that nobody can compete with, not the US, certainly not Europe, because of the amount of support and resources coming from the state into the economic activities. So if we Europeans, because we're pro-competition and a bit naive, and we're also lagging behind, throw ourselves in a market where we'll just be eaten up, it's not going to work. So if we want to go in that direction, because yes, I still believe economic ties have a disciplining effect that is helpful for political stability and for democracy, then it means that we would have to ask of our partners, competitors, and allies to have some respect of competition considerations. And that means for the US that you cannot have, and the geoeconomic times in which we live create an incentive for it, but you cannot have firms that are larger than life, that the democratic apparatus, so the public administration, can no longer control. And some of the tech companies, to me today, are part of this. Some of the, everybody I'm sure is aware of the satellite problem that Starlink implies for military operations. You have a lot of private actors today providing infrastructures that are so essential and that are outside of government purview, which means it's very hard for anybody to get into that market. And those are essential items that are being provided. So baseline for going forward, if we can agree on some sort of competition rule, this sounds so Brussels, I apologize, but if we can agree on some sort of baseline, how competition is acceptable, then everybody is happy to be part of it. But that means not competing against the state capitalism of China, which is just basically one big market failure. I'll cite my colleagues who said this, I think it was Janka Adel, and also on the US side, making sure you get the balance between public and private interests a little bit more in back.
John, do you want to handicap the possibility of reining in the tech oligarchs?
Well, I guess I don't disagree with the diagnosis of the problem. We do have tools that have been used, could be used for this purpose. Antitrust is a significant one. Actually, another interesting area we thought coming into the Trump administration of potential continuity was antitrust, and maybe even related technology. It turns out this administration has had zero appetite for actually using, or let's say low appetite for actually using this tool, but it still exists. It's still a facet of American law. And I think the concentration of private power in industries on which our country depends for its security and to a large extent now for our prosperity too, since the vast majority of growth in our stock market, of economic growth, is being generated by really like one sector of our economy, the AI investment. Yeah, that's a concern that I think we share.
So just one last question before we turn it over to the audience. One theme that recurred through today's discussions, or one word certainly that recurred, was sovereignty. It's a word that's a lot in the press these days and in all kinds of policy discussions. And unpacking that word is a lot of anxiety about having so much data in the clouds of American firms, so much technological, so much of the technology that Europe depends on coming from these few firms in the United States. And I guess I would just change the question a little bit by saying, what is that kind of imbalance? We heard today, I think 85% of the computing cloud in Europe is American. What is that kind of imbalance going to do even when negotiating partners of goodwill sit down together at some point in the future?
I think maybe a way to frame it is to use the concept of bullies, predators. So we have two kinds of bullies in that world against us in Europe: the private ones, the tech bro, and then some countries. The private bullies, I think, maybe I'm too optimistic, it's fixable. through antitrust policies, through different ways, through attacking their business model, which is capturing the data of our kids, I think it's fixable. The government, the bullies of the world, Russia and China, and at that moment, the US, but I put the US on the side for the China and Russia as bullies, and maybe Turkey at some moments. That's tougher. Because if we want to protect our car industry, we should now consider the possibility of closing up our market altogether to Chinese exports. That's it. No more. So can we go up to that point? I personally would support that. And tomorrow, airplanes, it's coming. Subsidized Chinese airplanes, heavily subsidized, killing the Airbus business model. It's coming. So the question for me is the private bullies, and they have all kinds of craziness, and they are killing themselves. But the Chinese bullies and Russian bullies, that's a different one. And so on both sides, we should cooperate with the US. And by the way, on the first one, which the conversation is already taking place, regardless of Trump, because maybe you know this story, but the policies applied by Europe on the tech regulation were thought through in the US by thinkers from the US. I mean, Shoshana Zuboff and Tristari. And then it was implemented in policies in Europe. And then it came back to California. And then, so we have already this conversation on the private bullies, but on the public bullies, I mean, that's much tougher. And I personally believe that in order to address China, we cannot do it alone.
So it's a fascinating conversation. I guess for some of us, I don't know if it's a nightmare scenario or just one of the worst scenarios is actually that the U.S. continues for the next few decades even to flip back and forth between administrations whose spirit are more or less in line with the pre-Trump era, and that are trying to have a strong relationship with Europe and believes that actually the combination of an alliance of democracies on both sides of the Atlantic is the best way to address most of the world's problems. And that alternates with, shall we say, a MAGA type of governance, which would be, I think, deeply destabilizing for global affairs. So we've already had this happen once. If you're a European and you go into negotiations with the U.S. In 2029, let's just say for argument's sake, how much can you embrace the U.S. if that is your fear?
Well, my answer to that question is I think we've all gotten very careful not to embrace the US too much, but this is why I don't think we will go back to the transatlantic relations before, just because the unpredictability became such a clear feature that, we were going through this thought experiment. How could Europe have reacted different to the IRA with trade agreements, etc.? Yes, if you really believe that once you have it down on paper, it'll actually hold up. But if we have to fear that 4 years down the road, somebody will rip it up and repeal it and move out of whatever a climate agreement again, or, what worth is it investing into some institutional embrace if it really is back and forth, which is why the only consensus I think you have on the European side is let's try as much of this as possible. Let's be as hopeful as possible. There's so much synergies and prosperity we can still get out if it works, but let's make sure we cover our backs. We have a hedging plan and we can actually fight it out for ourselves if push comes to shove.
And John, as an American policymaker, how do you go into that conversation?
First of all, I have to say, there are a lot of villains in my country and our policy in the world. I'm surprised that the IRA has become the dominant one in this conversation. I don't consider it as
I'm
such.
not making that argument.
I know you're not. No, look, here's what I would say. Joe Biden had a phrase that he used, as the first pro-Trump president, and there will be another one. First post-Trump president, not a pro-Trump president, and there will be another one. And he used to say,
correct the video.
exactly, redact the transcript. He used to say, "America is back," and it was a bit trite. I didn't love it, to be honest, but it was heartfelt, and it was the sort of the aura we were trying to imbue into the world. And, you could argue about how well it worked and how seriously people took it, but there is no chance that a next post-Trump president will be able to simply say that and walk back up to the head of the big tables and say, okay, I'm here and this is the agenda and let's go work on it. And, it was hard the last time. It's going to be impossible the next time. It doesn't mean we are not going to be welcomed back into kind of the community of nations that are our traditional allies. I think we will, but I think countries are going to treat us essentially as a temporary proposition, a next administration in a 4-year increment or maybe an 8-year increment. It would be irresponsible not to. And I'll just give one example of the kind of thing that I don't think will be possible anymore that happened in our administration. And Dan's heard me use this example, but we did a deal with the UK and Australia, very controversial in France. So sorry to raise this here. Yes, a deal called AUKUS, which was a deal to sell essentially nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. Just a big investment in our security architecture in the Indo-Pacific region. Massive investment for Australia, which agreed to put $5 billion into the American submarine industrial base. $5 billion Australian dollars. And they have paid now the lion's share of that money in exchange for submarines that they expect to be delivered in the late 2030s, probably because these things are never on time. Let's call it the early 2040s. I do not see countries making these almost multi-generational bets on the United States the way Australia chose to do, and they have stuck to it even in this era. And so far we have too, which is a good thing, but something I worry about. The way countries like Germany and France both made big bets on the United States during the 20th century that I think paid out very well for those countries and certainly for us as well. It's just going to be a harder proposition to argue that countries can tie their future so directly to us, given the swings, the wild swings back and forth in our view of the world and our own view of our democracy at home that you described.
Questions? Please wait for the mic, and preferably a short question.
Hi, hello. Thank you for the discussion. I'll keep it very short. I just want to add a thought into that that back and forth, because I think what could also happen in the not so far future is that we have not just the United States facing this kind of instability that we see now, but that we have key European powers going down the same road. And I just wanted to add that and how that changes the whole table when we have maybe Britain, France, or Germany facing similar issues. Thank you.
Who would like to take that on? Don't all jump up at once.
I'll say one thing about that as an American, and then one of you should also answer or both. But I have to say, when I talk about things that I think are positive and hopeful in the world, which isn't very often, but sometimes people try to pin you down to give an example after a depressing talk. I talk about Europe, actually, and I talk about the fact that given the kind of shocks to the system that I described earlier, Europe had a number of options available to it. One was maybe to massively hedge in the direction of other powerful countries like Russia and go back to buying Russian gas and increase the dependency there. And I know there are some voices that say that may be inevitable, but so far, at least, Germany has not done that. The rest of Europe hasn't done that. They could have also followed the United States down a far-right path. And this, I think, is an option that still kind of looms maybe over the horizon. I worry quite a bit about that. But so far, at least, the European countries that have had that opportunity have not taken it. And we've ejected at least one far-right leader of a European country, maybe the most prominent one, from office in the Trump period, which I think is a good thing. Welcome other views. The option that Europe has chosen is to try to stand on its own 2 feet and develop its own power and capability and sovereignty and all of the rest, which is, I think, something that should be supported by Americans, by others around the world, certainly by citizens here. But do I worry about exactly what you've just described? I do.
So I think it's absolutely true. Dark times might be coming in France, for instance. And so the issue is to already think about the reasons why we have this problem. And so it's not international economics there. It's also cultural questions, spiritual questions, loss of meaning, loss of dreams, fragmentations of societies. And so right now we should be thinking, and I'm trying to do that humbly, modestly with some others, about questions which are related to the situation of democracies from fragilities from the inside. So I mentioned some of them, the destruction of the public square. I mean, how to organize a democratic conversation. The question of the fact that capitalism is concentrating wealth in the same territories. The question of the impact of social networks on the brain of our kids. So we have to address that in Europe in order to be equipped to exit the dark times, because we have to think about that it's possible that we have to go through this moment. And on that, this is this is another set of questions when I think we should work with US friends, not the government, not public agencies, but with foundations, with universities, with NGOs, with thinkers, to be prepared to think about the dark times. I mean, I'm preparing the worst case scenario, but even if, I mean, in any case, to avoid the dark scenario and to be equipped to exit 5 years of limbos, we have to think about that. So we spoke a lot during the workshop about challenges on democracies from the outside, but we have also to think about from the inside.
So if I can just add one word, 2 or 3 years ago, we did our annual Holbrook workshop on the question of far-right parties and how well they implement their foreign policy views in when they get into government. And the conclusion was that so far, and this is obviously something that depends on circumstance, European right-wing parties have made very, very little difference to the national foreign policies because of the parliamentary systems that require coalitions and impose discipline on them. The scholar who did it, Professor Andy Moravchik of Princeton, said at that point, and this was, as I said, 23 or 24, he said, the big worry is the US. Anyway.
Thank you for
Can you just introduce yourself? Sorry. No, you.
Thank you for the interesting insights presented. Let me expand a bit on the title for tonight, Recalibrating the Transatlantic Economic Relationship, and expand that a bit. Would US policy advisors advise Mark Carney for Canada to join the European Union, which would be the logical endpoint of his Davos speech, actually, and fitting in line? Thank you.
I can answer that. So I've people find it completely ludicrous that Canada would want to join the European Union. I've lived in France long enough that Quebec has always considered itself to be a potential ally to France. Why not even join? So I don't find the question ludicrous. And I do think, I mean, we can do a Eurovision Song Contest with Israel and Australia in it. Why can't we do a European Union with Canada in it? I don't think it will be the European Union we now know. What we do have is a growing web of coalitions of, sometimes called the willing. I find that it's not my favorite term, but if there are things where you can work intensively together in different configurations on certain issues with Ukraine, on other issues with Canada, again on other issues with, I don't know, Norway or Australia, I think it makes sense. So let's think through what that would actually mean. Would I advise Mark Carney to do that as a foreign policy maxim? I don't know. I'm not Canadian. You should tell me. But I do have to say Canada really is in a tougher spot than Europe. I believe we weren't envying each other, because Canada is North America so closely linked and has such a huge border with the US that they really have to grapple with what their future relationship will be. I'm sure you have other conversations about this, and they certainly are thinking hard about de-risking in ways that to us seem are not on the table.
Do you want to advise the Prime Minister?
So also not Canadian, don't tend to advise
from Vermont.
Foreign governments, but I am from southern Canada,
Yeah.
Vermont. Canada's part of NATO. Canada at the State Department, where Dan and I both worked, used to be part of essentially the Europe Bureau in terms of how it was managed bureaucratically, which I always thought was interesting. No longer the case. Now it's part of the Western Hemisphere Bureau. That seems to make a bit more sense. I would want to see the analysis actually of kind of economically what the difference being part of the single market would make versus just having some sort of expansive FTA between Canada and Europe. But regardless of whether they formally join the European Union, I don't think there's any question that Canada needs to have a deeper, more integrated approach to the world with Europe, with the UK, than maybe it did before. And it was already pretty deeply integrated and pretty coordinated in terms of that relationship. But that has got to be where they go. But they have to do that in a way that balances against the very real risk in the current moment of retaliation of any kind from the Trump administration. I mean, everybody's making these calculations now. So it is not worth lighting their relationship with Trump or the United States on fire if that's how he would react. I have no idea how he would react to this. But should Canada invest much more heavily in that relationship as a kind of balance against the risk in the United States in the future? Sure, that would be very rational to me.
You have the mic already. Well, then go ahead.
Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, I'm Heidi Kalin, as a journalist from Estonia. And I would be interested, how could we make Europe and the US more competitive together? Because China is very competitive. And this is a problem for us as democrats also. And how can we do it in times where there's not only war in Europe, but we have also policies and environmental policies that are actually destroying our industry in a way. I mean, I had a very interesting discussion also at the American Academy with the former Trump advisor, McMaster, and he said, for example, turning off the nuclear plants and buying gas from Putin is like a jump off the cliff into the hands of Putin. And I can only agree with it, as this is for the German policy, And I can only agree that environmental protection is very, very important, but you have to do it in a right way so that you also don't kill your industry. So how can we do it together so that we are the democracies? And I also very much agree that we have to cooperate and be there for each other, although the Trump administration might make it a little bit difficult. But how? Would you have any solutions for that?
So it's a big question, but let me frame your question. I don't think Nord Stream 2 happened just for greening the environment. I think it happened because German industry wanted cheap energy. Yeah. I'll make it very simple. But when we talk about this, I actually have a PhD student working her thesis on the so-called energy trilemma, which is that in energy, there are three objectives you try to attain. One is affordable energy, one is secure energy, and one is an ecological transition, so an energy transition. And you kind of navigate in that space, and you can move away from one side too far, and then you're trying to kind of be in the middle, but it's hard to get all three simultaneously. And what Germany, and I share your criticism, I think it was a terrible policy period, let's say, but what Angela Merkel says in her defense during that period, because she wasn't naive about Vladimir Putin at all. She knew well enough what this implied, but she said there was absolutely no way to go against the German industry's demands for cheap energy in a context where, yes, the nuclear power plants have been cut off, and people were also a bit more optimistic about relationships eastward, which all of the Baltic and Central Eastern European countries were very upset about, but Germany didn't want to listen. So bad policy choice, yes. I don't think there's a solution, but I do think it's important to remember that energy is one of these areas where you have competing objectives and you need to find the sweetest possible spot in that trilemma.
It's back there.
Thank you. I would like to know about the expectation from G20. It could be a chance to solve or to avoid more conflicts in a new way of handle rules anyway, or to discuss something about WTO. Because there are a lot of consultations and about this, and the discrepancy between markets and relations between United States, China, and Africa is really, in Europe, is really a big problem.
While they decide which of our panelists want to speak, I will just say that one of the themes of the day was including the global South far more effectively in key deliberations going forward. Sounds like John's decided to answer.
I guess somewhat ironically, the G20 might be one of the few institutions that has maybe more potential in a Trump administration than in the administration that either of the administrations I served in. I'm not sure that's a good thing, by the way, because which of the countries in the G20 this administration is likely to line up with to try to pursue an agenda if they believed in multilateralism, which they don't particularly. So I don't actually think this will happen. But if it did, I'm not sure people here would like the outcome of what would be foisted on them by a pretty powerful potential block of countries, and the United States maybe shifting from one side of that equation to the other. So I would worry about that, actually, as opposed to hope that it happens. I don't think it'll happen, in large part because just generally multilateralism is not something this administration seems committed to.
But further down the line?
Further down the line in the different administration?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a challenging format for a traditional American administration, largely because of the membership. And I think that is going to remain the case until we have different leadership in Russia at a minimum. That opens up, I think, a range of possibilities. That could be a very long time down the road, or it could not. Who knows? China is a country the United States can and should be able to work with more, I think, and I'll even say more than we did in the Biden administration. But the G20 is tough, less because of China and frankly more because of Russia.
I would even be more definite about it. Multilateral solutions like this between 20 countries, you think the European Union is slow and complicated, and we're 27 and we just turned around Hungary and it still remains difficult. Try the whole thing at the G20 level. I don't think that's going to be very durable. What I do think is that there are a lot of other countries now thinking about coalitions and allies outside of the usual Western-dominated hemisphere, and Brazil is very interested in building Brazil-China ties. I don't know if that will remain after Lula, but all of Latin America does a whole Davos has shown us you can forget about the Western world. Let's try to see what we can get out of Latin America sticking together. And I think that's interesting. I think that's a development to watch. Is there going to be something from the Indian Latin American cooperation coming out that we should watch? Is there something from what India is doing in the region? But I don't think G20, those are concepts that typically when you actually go on the ground will fizzle away quite quickly because they have no real existence. So I would look at bilateral relationships and initiatives driven by different countries.
Sorry.
Oh, it's already been delivered. Okay, great.
Timothy Chan. I was an alumnus of the Hertie School as well. I have a jumble of questions which I'll make in one coherent whole, which is following on the question of economic order and governance. Given that the transatlantic relationship has always been the linchpin of global economic governance, think of the WTO, the Bretton Woods, and whatnot. But given the shrinking share of Europe in the global economy and the steady share of the American economy, and given the Chinese shot and the Chinese dominance in trade, finance, and whatnot, what sort of global economic order are we looking at, essentially, right? That's my question in a sense. And from Global South, I'm a Malaysian. One, if we take the assumption that export-oriented growth is the only way to prosperity, given the experience of Southeast Asia and East Asia, what does this leave for many other countries when China wants to dominate exports, in a sense? Yeah. And also on the Canada question, we talked about Canada joining EU. What about the EU joining CPTPP?
Don't look so happy, Ronald.
No, I mean,
I think it's on.
maybe in a deliberate way, I will not directly answer your question, but I have to explain. We cannot control that anymore. But we can try to control what we can do in common inside Europe, starting with Germany and France and Germany and Italy and Germany and Spain. And if already we do that, we would have delivered a big service for us, but also for the sake of maybe beefing up global multilateralism. So I don't know about Malaysia and Brazil. I don't know. I know that we are being accused of colonialism and legacy issues. So let's start with what we can do inside Europe, and including the Eurozone, by the way, because the US, you do have a monetary policy attached to a budgetary policy attached to a fiscal policy. We are just amateurs. Our monetary policy is full of loopholes. I mean, you go to any university, you take a book about economics, you have what they call a policy mix. Monetary policy attached to budgetary policy, financed by fiscal policy. We don't have that. We have one leg, the monetary policy. We don't have a common budget for the Eurozone right now. So we should fix that before trying to think what we can do with Malaysia. And so at least we are stakeholders of that conversation. So of course, by mentioning this question of budget for the Eurozone, I'm a little bit provocative here in Germany, but it's an example. Today, we don't have the basic means of having a common economic policy right now. So for me, it would be the priority of us in Europe before trying to think about the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question for you, John. You served under the Obama administration and Biden's administration. So you remember that President Obama was also not very happy with Angela Merkel about defense spending, trade surplus. In 2028, where a lot of Germans probably hope that there will be again a Democrat as a president, Gavin Newsom, whoever, how do you see the transatlantic economic relationship? Because the issues will be still there. So will be there a certain kind of continuation of tariffs and all these others, or do you see an entire shift of policies? Perhaps you could try to explain a little bit your ideas. Thank you very much.
Well, I guess one thing I'd say is you said Gavin Newsom, there are going to be 20 Democrats probably who run for president, and it's going to be a true free-for-all, very wide spectrum of views on domestic policy, on economic policy, on foreign policy. So, that'll be different from what we've had in recent history in the United States. We had a bunch of people who ran in 2020, but more recently than that, it's been pretty clear who the candidate was going to be. And so, there's going to be a contest of various visions for the future on all of these topics, including the ones you describe. The one thing, though, that was clear from my previous service, but also from the conversation that we had today, is none of this is going to be like seamless and easy and fully aligned. And, there are a lot of differences, even in an administration like Joe Biden's that was, you will not find probably another American president who is as committed a transatlanticist as Joe Biden was. We probably will never have that again. Just, he grew up in an era of foreign policy where the Cold War and the relationship with Europe were foreign policy. Many of us who are from later generations focused on other regions of the world, the Middle East. More recently, lots of people specialize in China, but from his era, this place, literally where we are right now, was everything. And so it's going to be different, actually, I think, in future generations of American leadership. And that actually does put a bit of responsibility on Europe to demonstrate the value proposition of the relationship that was intuitive for Joe Biden, and still the relationship was sometimes challenging. It is going to be less intuitive for American leaders going forward. That is just going to be part of the deal. So, part of that is on us, those of us who focus on foreign policy, to explain to leaders why this relationship is so important. Some of it is obvious, the economic ties, the security, but it's not going to be felt in the bones in the way that it has been in the past. That's just the reality.
Okay, I think we have our last question right here. Oh, we have one more back there, so try to get them.
What makes you so confident that Europe will be able to successfully implement an industrial policy? I mean, do you have any positive precedents from the last 30 years? Any edifying precedents, except maybe for Airbus?
To me?
Well, no, not necessarily. I think in the Reagan administration, actually, industrial policy was more or less banned from public use as a kind of un-American term. And looking closer to home, Switzerland actively considered introducing an industrial policy 2 years ago and decided against it. It's ineffective and expensive. And they said, well, our industrial policy is horizontal, good education, low taxation, good infrastructure. I think that's what we should do. We should not have sectorial industrial policy, so more Switzerland and less Breton, von der Leyen, and Séjourné. And I'm not talking to you in particular, but obviously welcome your answer.
I mean, it was very friendly. The reference you use, Switzerland, I think is a good summary of the narrative. Do we want to be Switzerland?
I'll answer differently. We had a long discussion on what is industrial policy, and the way you asked your question is an industrial policy where you pick winners and you invest in them. And I think the challenge currently for Europe is to try to find an industrial policy which is a support to industrial development that is not picking winners and over-investing. And we had a very interesting discussion, some people here in the room, on at what point do companies actually need the support, and it's certainly not when they're already quite well developed, which is what we've done in the past. So your point is well taken, but I do think that industrial policy can be a lot of things, and Germany in particular, Europe more generally, has gone through 20 years of denying that industrial policy happens, even while they were doing some form of industrial policy. And I think today, having that discussion, what does it mean to have an industrial policy, writing industrial policy strategies, is a useful exercise, because it's a very hard thing to do, it's a very hard thing to get right, but it's an absolute necessity, not just because it's an arsenal of democracy, but simply because everybody does it in some form of way, and the denial is the worst of all possible strategies.
Last question back there.
Thank you. I would be interested to hear from you, how would you de-risk the digital dependency of Europe? This is just the opposite of industrial policy. I think the industrial policy equivalent in the digital realm is that there is no guardrails, no policy, nothing. And that is just cementing the strong dominance. But against that background, so I think it's not the template of industrial policy we can discuss here. So what are your thoughts about de-risking digital dependency of Europe?
Well, I think what a lot of people who are working in the space are doing is insisting on the need to at least try to build, even if we have a lot of catching up. And it's not just digital sovereignty. I think for me, it's digital sovereignty and AI development. We are completely dependent, and there's a lot of people now trying to think on what does it take to build a European cloud? What does it take to have knowledge and expertise? If you look at Baden-Württemberg, Heilbronn, and in particular what the Schwarz group is trying to create with the AI ecosystem that they're building, those are all answers to trying to create at least the beginning of an ecosystem that can develop up. And of course, the government is very involved in some of the public sector involvement in this. Does that mean we'll be up to speed? No. Are there any companies that will be able to compete either with China or the US tech industry? No. But at least it means that we're trying to work on solutions that for certain questions. I remember my jaw just dropped when the MI5 UK Secret Service needed a cloud and decided to put all of their data. I think it was Amazon Web Cloud for a dedicated thing, and I'm like, wow, that's one hell of intelligence cooperation when you literally put your Secret Service information on a cloud of a foreign country. So that's something we obviously will have to do differently, and in different departments of the administration. On the German side, on the European side, there is interesting thinking going on, but it's a long way to go because we are technically challenged. What's the word? Really lagging behind. So it's not going to be an easy route, but at least the realization that that's something to work on is there.
Okay, I want to thank all of our panelists for participating tonight.